The question of what makes a country or a society wealthy is one that has been of interest to economists and philosophers for a very long time. In the 16th to the 18th centuries, that's 1500s to the late 1700s, the dominant philosophy of what makes a country wealthy in Europe was called mercantilism. Believers of this philosophy were called mercantilists. Now, mercantilism had many aspects and elements to it, but the key economic element had to do with what makes a country wealthy. The belief among the mercantilists was that the wealth of a country was determined mainly by the quantity of gold and silver that the country had. And their argument was that as a consequence, a country, its government, should follow policies that would increase the amount of gold and silver that was available to that country. This had implications for trade. What they argued was that a country should follow a policy where they should export more. You export more than you import, with the consequence that the difference between the two, the value of your exports and the value of your imports, the difference is going to be paid for by other countries, your trading partners, in gold and silver. If you export more than you import, then the amount of gold and silver in your country will increase and make the country wealthier. In 1776, Adam Smith, who is often regarded as the founder of modern economics, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which became the foundation of modern economic thinking. And in The Wealth of Nations, as the title suggests, one of the key questions that he thought about was what makes a country wealthy. His argument was that what makes a country wealthy is not really the amount of gold and silver that is in the country. You can have a treasury full of gold and silver, and your population can still be living in very destitute circumstances. They may not have enough to eat, they may not have clothes to wear, they may not have adequate housing. So even if a country has a lot of gold and silver in its treasury, it may not make the people of a country wealthy. The key argument that modern economists, starting with Adam Smith, have made is that what makes a country, a society, a nation wealthy is the country's ability, the society's ability to produce goods and services. And that is our fundamental economic principle number 4. Standards of living depend on productivity in a society. At one level, this seems almost self-evident. Food that is not produced, food that is not grown, it cannot be eaten. Houses that are not produced, houses that are not built, cannot be lived in. A bus that is not produced, it cannot be ridden. And as a consequence, production is a prerequisite for consumption. And because consumption determines our standards of living, do we have good food? Do we have adequate clothing? Do we have adequate housing? Standards of living depend on productivity. A society that has people that are more productive is generally going to have a standard of living that is higher than a society that has lower productivity levels. Let's now think about US productivity compared to both other countries currently, as well as to the United States historically. US productivity at the current time is very high in comparison to both the vast majority of countries in the world today, as well as in comparison to the United States historically. So let me give you a couple of numbers. The standard measure, the most commonly used measure of productivity in a society is per capita GDP. Gross domestic product is usually abbreviated as GDP. This is not a perfect measure of productivity and standards of living, but this is a reasonable first approximation. So There are flaws with this measure, but I will not talk about those in this video. It's a reasonable first approximation of both productivity in a society and standards of living in a society. In the United States, in 2017-2018, the per capita GDP per year, this is approximately $58,000. Even though there is a great deal of variation in incomes across individuals, at the overall social level, what this means is that most Americans enjoy a standard of living that is extraordinarily high. So, for a point of comparison, if we go back a little more than 100 years, in the year 1900, most Americans had standards of living that present day Americans would regard as extreme poverty. So in 1900, no more than about 10% of Americans lived in homes that had flush toilets. Only about 8% had central heating. Only 2% of American homes in 1900 had electricity. Those today are regarded as basic necessities, and we would regard the absence of these features in our homes as extreme poverty. If we compare American living standards to living standards in other countries in the current time frame, in terms of the ability to purchase goods and services, incomes in China are in the approximate range of 17,000 US dollars. In India, this number is about $7,000 per person per year. In Afghanistan, this is about $2,000 per person per year. In the poorest countries in the world, this figure is actually less than $1,000 per person per year. And standards of living are correspondingly lower in those countries. In this and subsequent discussions on the relationship between productivity and standards of living, it is really important to keep one fact, one caveat, one warning in mind. High productivity, high levels of productivity are necessary for high levels of standards of living, but they don't necessarily guarantee high standards of living for everyone in society. Productivity creates the goods that improve the standard of living, but other circumstances affect which people in society get to enjoy the benefits from that productivity. The distribution of the benefits of productivity can often be uneven, and it often depends on factors such as the relative strength of bargaining positions between employers and employees, the relative tax rates on the rich versus the poor. As an extreme example, consider the situation of Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is a small country with large petroleum reserves. The income from the petroleum produced in the country is enough, on average, to make their citizens quite wealthy by world standards. However, most of the people in Equatorial Guinea remain desperately poor. A small ruling elite captures pretty much all of the benefits from the oil production and is fabulously wealthy. So this is a situation where society actually produces quite a bit, but the distribution of the benefits from that production is highly uneven. If you think about the United States, closer to home, during the last 40 years in the US, median wages have stagnated despite improvements in productivity. Most of the benefits from higher productivity have gone to people who are better educated than the median worker. And in particular, the very rich have enjoyed a disproportionate share of the gains in productivity during the last 40 years in the United States.